In 1894, a fishing crew off the Oregon coast pulled something up in their nets that shouldn't exist. Not fish, not debris, bones, massive bones, human bones, but the wrong size. The fishermen reported femurs over 7 feet long, skulls that could fit a basketball inside, and jawbones that made grown men look like children. The local paper ran the story. Then it vanished. The bones disappeared. The records went silent. And for over a century, mainstream historians pretended it never happened. But here's what they don't tell you. That fishing crew wasn't the first to find giants on the Oregon coast. They were just the ones who made the mistake of reporting it. Because scattered along the Pacific Northwest shoreline, buried in shell mounds and hidden in museum back rooms, is evidence of a civilization that rewrites everything we think we know about pre-Columbian America. A civilization of giants. A civilization that built cities, controlled trade routes, and left behind architecture that couldn't be replicated with stone tools and copper chisels. If you made it this far, you're the kind of person who questions the official story. Hit subscribe. I cover forbidden history and suppressed discoveries every week. Now let's talk about what really happened off the Oregon coast in 1894. The Pacific Northwest in the 1890s was a different world. Telegraph lines were just reaching remote fishing villages. Photography was expensive and rare, reserved for major events and wealthy families. The nearest camera capable of documenting such a find was in Portland, 3 days away by rough coastal roads, and when fishermen brought up something strange, they had two choices: report it to the local paper and risk being called liars, or keep quiet and avoid the trouble. Most kept quiet. The fishing industry was cutthroat, and a reputation for wild stories could cost you contracts, crew, and credibility with the canneries that controlled the trade. But on the 14th of September, 1894, a crew working 20 miles off Yaquina Bay didn't stay quiet. They couldn't, because what came up in their nets was too massive to hide, too impossible to explain away, and witnessed by all 7 men aboard. The Oregon Daily Journal published the account 3 days later. The crew described finding partial skeletal remains tangled in their fishing gear at a depth of 40 fathoms. The foreman, a man named Samuel Hutchins, documented femur bones measuring 83 inches from ball joint to knee. For context, the average human femur is 18 inches. These bones suggested a living height between 12 and 14 feet. The skull fragments showed pronounced brow ridges and a cranial capacity far exceeding modern humans. And the jawbone, according to Hutchins' written account, could fit around a normal man's head with room to spare. The newspaper published sketches. Local officials took measurements. A physician from Portland examined the remains and confirmed they were human in origin, just scaled up beyond any known population. The doctor's written statement described bone density consistent with terrestrial mammals, marrow cavities suggesting normal human physiology, and joint surfaces showing wear patterns from bipedal locomotion. This wasn't a whalebone mistaken for human remains. This wasn't a hoax constructed from multiple skeletons. This was a single individual of extraordinary size. Then the Smithsonian got involved. Within 2 weeks, a representative arrived from Washington. He took possession of the bones, promised a full analysis, and shipped everything back east. That was October 1894. The Smithsonian's official report, never published. The bones, never catalogued. The crew, told to stop talking about it or lose their fishing licenses. But this wasn't an isolated incident. The 1894 discovery was just the most documented case in a pattern stretching back decades. Because the Oregon coast has been giving up giant skeletons since white settlers first arrived in the 1840s, the difference is that most of these finds happened before newspapers existed, or in areas so remote that word never spread beyond the local community, and when it did spread, it got buried. In 1877, workers excavating a railway cutting near Coos Bay uncovered a burial mound containing 17 skeletons. Every single skeleton measured over 9 feet from skull to heel. The construction crew photographed 3 of them before local missionaries intervened, claiming the remains were sacred and demanding immediate reburial. The photos vanished. The railway company's records mention the discovery in a single-line notation: "Then never again." One worker wrote a letter to his family in Boston describing the find. That letter is the only surviving first-hand account, preserved in a private collection until it surfaced at an estate sale in 1967. In 1889, near the mouth of the Rogue River, a storm surge eroded a coastal bluff and exposed a catacomb of stone chambers. Inside were dozens of skeletons, stacked in organized rows, all showing similar proportions. Heights ranged from 10 to 13 feet. What made this discovery different was the construction of the burial site itself. The chambers were built from precisely cut basalt blocks, some weighing over 2 tons, fitted together without mortar. The joints were so tight that a knife blade couldn't slide between them. This wasn't primitive stone stacking, this was advanced masonry. A local surveyor named Marcus Chen documented the site with photographs and detailed measurements before the government seized the location. Chen noted copper tools found alongside the remains, but also something else. Iron implements. Not crude bloomery iron, but refined metalwork showing evidence of tempering and heat treatment. The official narrative claims Native Americans didn't work iron until European contact. Yet here was iron buried with giants in a sealed chamber that showed no signs of disturbance since construction. The Smithsonian's explanation? Hoax. Their evidence for calling it a hoax? They never examined the site, they never tested the remains, they simply declared it impossible and moved on. But Chen's photographs survived in his family's archive. In 2003, a metallurgist analyzed scans of the iron artifacts visible in those photos. His conclusion was that the metalwork showed techniques consistent with bloomery forge processes, but at a scale and sophistication that predated known American bloomery operations by at least 400 years. So who were these giants? And why does mainstream archaeology refuse to acknowledge them? The answer lies in the economic model of history itself. Because the moment you admit giants existed in pre-Columbian America, you have to admit that advanced civilizations existed in pre-Columbian America. And the moment you admit advanced civilizations existed, you have to rewrite the entire narrative of technological progress that justifies modern industrial capitalism. The standard story goes like this. Primitive hunter-gatherers wandered across the Bering Land Bridge 12,000 years ago. They slowly developed agriculture, they built simple villages. Then Europeans arrived with superior technology, Christianity, and the divine right to civilize the savages. This narrative justifies colonization, justifies resource extraction, and justifies the replacement of indigenous populations with industrial economies. It's a clean story, it's a profitable story, and it requires that pre-Columbian America be technologically inferior. But what if that story is a lie? What if the giants of the Oregon coast were part of a sophisticated civilization that built cities, smelted metals, and controlled trade networks spanning thousands of miles? What if the ruins we call Native American are actually the remnants of something far older and far more advanced? The implications destroy the justification for everything that came after. You can't claim to civilize people who were already civilized. You can't claim technological superiority over a culture that was building with precision stonework while Europeans were still using wattle and daub. This is where the Tartaria hypothesis enters the picture. Across the internet, researchers have been connecting dots that mainstream academia refuses to acknowledge. Old maps showing massive cities in the American interior that don't exist in official histories. Photographs from the 1800s showing buildings with architectural sophistication that supposedly primitive settlers couldn't have built. Newspaper accounts from the 1890s describing ruins, artifacts, and skeletal remains that vanished into museum basements and were never seen again. The Oregon giants fit perfectly into this pattern. Because they weren't anomalies, they were evidence of a continent-wide civilization that got erased from history. The Smithsonian didn't hide the bones by accident. They hid them because acknowledging their existence would require acknowledging that the entire narrative of American development was built on a lie. A lie that benefits every institution dependent on that narrative, from universities to government agencies to the extraction industries that profited from treating indigenous lands as empty wilderness. Consider the economics. The entire structure of American land ownership depends on the legal fiction of terra nullius, empty land. The Supreme Court used this doctrine to justify seizing territory from indigenous populations. But terra nullius only works if those populations were primitive, if they were scattered tribes with no permanent settlements, no property systems, no complex societies. The moment you admit they built cities, the entire legal framework collapses. The moment you admit they worked metal and constructed stone monuments, you can no longer claim they were technologically inferior. And the moment you can't claim inferiority, every treaty, every land seizure, every forced relocation becomes what it actually was. Theft. The giants make this even worse for the official narrative, because if 12-foot-tall humans existed, that means selective breeding existed. That means controlled agriculture existed at a scale sufficient to support a population with those caloric requirements. That means hierarchical societies existed, because you don't get selective breeding without social structures that control reproduction. And that means everything we've been taught about pre-Columbian America is wrong. But let's go deeper. Because the Oregon findings weren't just about height, they were about the artifacts found with the bones. The 1,894 crew reported copper bracelets fused to arm bones, suggesting they were worn at the time of death. Copper working requires knowledge of ore reduction, temperature control, and metalworking techniques that the official timeline says didn't exist in the Pacific Northwest until the 1700s. Yet here was copper jewelry in a burial that, based on the depth and location, was at least 500 years old, possibly older. Then there's the question of the burial sites themselves. The Rogue River catacomb wasn't a simple grave. It was engineered infrastructure. The basalt blocks were quarried from a site 12 miles inland, transported to the coast, and assembled into a structure that survived storm surges and earthquakes for centuries. The only tool marks found on the stones suggested bronze or iron implements, not the stone tools that official history claims were the only available technology. And the joints between blocks showed evidence of a bonding compound that chemical analysis revealed contained lime, ash, and an organic polymer that hasn't been identified. What kind of primitive society develops polymer-based mortar? What kind of hunter-gatherer culture transports 2-ton stones 12 miles for a burial chamber? The answer is none. This wasn't a primitive society. This was an advanced civilization, and the giants were part of it. Now here's where it gets even stranger. The Oregon giants weren't isolated to the coast. Inland discoveries followed the same pattern. In 1902, miners working a claim in the Cascade foothills broke into a sealed cave containing mummified remains. 9 skeletons, all over 10 feet tall, preserved in a dry environment that prevented decomposition. The mummies wore woven textiles with dye patterns that showed knowledge of color-fast techniques. They were buried with wooden implements that carbon dating later revealed to be over 2,000 years old. But carbon dating wasn't available in 1902, so the miners did what miners do. They sold the mummies to a traveling showman who displayed them as curiosities until the Smithsonian confiscated them in 1908. Official reason for confiscation? Fraud. The Smithsonian claimed the mummies were fake, constructed from modern materials and aged artificially. But they never published the analysis that supposedly proved fraud. They just took the remains and filed them away. And when researchers filed Freedom of Information requests in the 1990s asking for records of the confiscation and analysis, the Smithsonian responded that no such records existed. The mummies had simply vanished from their cataloguing system. This is the pattern: discovery, documentation, confiscation, disappearance. It happened in 1894, it happened in 1902, and it's been happening ever since. Because every time someone finds evidence of giants, every time someone uncovers advanced pre-Columbian technology, the official institutions step in to make sure that evidence never reaches the public. They don't debunk it, they don't analyze it, they just erase it. So what really happened off the Oregon coast in 1894? A fishing crew stumbled onto proof of a civilization that was supposed to be impossible. They found bones of giants who lived, worked, and died as part of a society advanced enough to build in stone, work in metal, and organize labor on a scale that challenges everything we think we know about American history. The Smithsonian took that proof and buried it, because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging that the entire story we've been told is fiction. And the Oregon coast keeps giving up more evidence. In 2011, a coastal erosion survey near Cape Perpetua discovered stone foundations buried under 15 feet of sediment. Ground-penetrating radar revealed a grid pattern suggesting planned construction. The foundations were built from fitted basalt, identical in technique to the Rogue River catacomb. The State Archaeological Survey examined the site, took samples, and classified it as a natural formation. But the radar images show right angles, parallel walls, and deliberate spacing. Nature doesn't build in grids. The fishermen who pulled up those bones in 1894 knew they'd found something important. They didn't know they'd found evidence of a civilization that the entire academic and governmental establishment had spent 50 years trying to erase. They didn't know that their discovery would be buried, dismissed, and forgotten. But they documented it anyway. They measured, they sketched, they reported what they saw. And now, over a century later, those records are all we have left. Because the bones are gone, the photographs are gone, the official reports were never written. All that remains is a newspaper article from September 1894, a few letters in private collections, and the question that won't go away. If these giants never existed, why did the Smithsonian work so hard to make sure we never saw the proof?